Miss Marple and the note that said, "You're next." Chapter 1. The Village Whispers. The train to Little Beechwood rattled gently along the countryside, past rolling green fields and hedgerows dappled with the last golden hues of autumn. Miss Marple, comfortably seated by the window, folded her hands over her handbag and allowed herself a small smile. It had been some time since she had visited Sylvia Ashford, an old friend from her youth, and the thought of a few peaceful days in a quiet village was most agreeable. Stepping onto the platform, she found Little Beechwood just as she had imagined, a charming, unhurried place with ivy-clad cottages, a modest high street, and a church steeple standing proudly against the pale blue sky. Sylvia was already waiting for her, bundled in a neat tweed coat, her warm expression lined with age but no less familiar. "Oh, Jane, how lovely to see you!" she exclaimed, embracing her friend warmly. "And you, dear Sylvia," Miss Marple replied, tucking her arm into hers as they strolled toward the village square. "Little Beechwood is exactly as I imagined, so delightfully unspoiled." Sylvia let out a sigh, half amusement, half something else. "Perhaps on the surface, Jane, but even here things have been unsettling of late." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Sylvia hesitated, then shook her head with a forced little laugh. "Oh, it's nothing. Just village chatter, you know." Miss Marple said nothing, merely giving her friend an understanding smile. She had long learned that, in quiet places, it was often the whispers that held the most truth. A short walk later, the two friends settled into a cozy corner of the Golden Pheasant, a small tea room with lace curtains and the inviting aroma of fresh scones. The place was busy with villagers, and Miss Marple noted the way conversations lowered to hushed tones whenever someone new entered. Sylvia ordered tea and seed cake, and as they waited, Miss Marple let her gaze drift, listening without seeming to. She had always found that people spoke most freely when they believed they were not being listened to. "Drop dead just like that, they say," came a woman's voice from the next table. "Oh, nonsense. It was his heart, wasn't it? He wasn't a young man." "A heart attack?" Another voice scoffed. "Then what do you make of the note?" Miss Marple's ears pricked up slightly. "Hush!" the first woman hissed. "Not here." At that moment their tea arrived and Sylvia hesitated before speaking. "It's about Edwin Lansing," she said, stirring her tea absently. "He died 2 nights ago. Officially, it was a heart attack. But there's been talk." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "What sort of talk?" Sylvia leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "They found a note in his pocket. Just 1 sentence, written in block letters." Miss Marple set her cup down gently. "And what did it say?" Sylvia hesitated before answering. "It said, 'You're next.'" For a moment, only the sound of cups clinking filled the air. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but she felt the first stirrings of curiosity. It was always the little things, after all. A strange word here, an uneasy glance there, a sense that something was not quite right, and Miss Marple had long learned that, where there was a mystery, the truth was never far behind. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully as Sylvia Ashford leaned in, lowering her voice. "They found a note in his pocket, Jane, a single slip of paper." Miss Marple glanced up, her expression expectant but patient. Sylvia hesitated, then finally said it. It said, "You're next." Miss Marple's fingers paused on the handle of her teacup. A curious choice of words, a threat, a warning, or something else entirely. "And the police?" she asked, stirring her tea once more. "Oh, they've dismissed it, of course," Sylvia sighed, leaning back. "Heart attack, they said. The note's just a What did Inspector Turner call it? A coincidence? Most likely a childish prank? Miss Marple gave a slight nod, though her mind was already at work. A coincidence? How often that word was misused. People liked to believe in them, but she had found, in her many years of observation, that true coincidences were far rarer than one might think. She set down her cup. And yet people are talking. Sylvia hesitated. Well, yes. It's not every day a man dies suddenly and has something like that in his pocket. She tapped her teaspoon absently against her saucer. Some say Edwin had been acting oddly before he died. Jumpy. As if something was troubling him. But Jane, he was a sensible man. Hardly one for, well, hysteria. Miss Marple simply smiled. She had found that even the most sensible people had their fears, and fear often had a most inconvenient way of revealing itself. Miss Marple let her gaze drift across the tea room. Conversations hummed around them, the sound of china cups clinking gently against their saucers, the occasional burst of polite laughter. But beneath it all there was something else. A tension, a wariness, a watchfulness. At the far end of the room, Mr. Phelps, the village grocer, was speaking in hushed tones to his wife. His eyes darted toward Sylvia and Miss Marple, then away again. A guilty look, or merely a nervous one? Near the window, Mrs. Lorimer, the vicar's wife, was buttering her scone with unnecessary force, her fingers white-knuckled against the knife. And at the counter, young Alice Turner, the postmistress, kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone, or fearing they might arrive. Miss Marple sipped her tea. People always revealed more than they intended. It was in the way they folded their napkins, how they stirred their tea, or how they avoided a subject so obviously that they only drew more attention to it. A voice broke her thoughts. "It's not safe to speak too much of these things," muttered a woman at the next table. Miss Marple didn't turn, but she caught Sylvia's slight stiffening. "Really, Beatrice," came another voice, lower and sharper. "You mustn't spread such talk." Miss Marple let the conversation pass, as if she hadn't heard it at all. But she had, and already she knew one thing for certain. There was something more to this than just a simple heart attack. Chapter 2. Another death and a growing fear. The morning air in Little Beechwood carried an unfamiliar tension, thick as the low mist that clung to the village green. The news spread quickly. Margaret Felton was dead. By mid-morning, the villagers had gathered in small clusters outside the post office, the general store, and the churchyard, whispering in urgent, half-hushed voices. "First Edwin Lansing, and now this," muttered Mrs. Carter, her arms folded tightly across her chest. 2 deaths in a matter of days. "Margaret was in fine health," said Mr. Phelps, the grocer, his usual brisk tone laced with unease. "Not the sort to just drop dead." "Then how did she die?" asked Alice Turner, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause. "Poison," said Beatrice Harper, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "The doctor's calling it natural causes, but they say he looked troubled when he left." Across the village, Miss Marple listened, not speaking, not interrupting, just listening. This was the sound of fear taking hold. It was one thing to pass off Edwin Lansing's death as a heart attack, but 2 deaths? That was a pattern. Sylvia Ashford reached for Miss Marple's arm. "Jane," she said quietly, "there's something else." Miss Marple looked at her expectantly. Sylvia swallowed, as though reluctant to say the words aloud. "They found another note." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Sylvia continued, her voice low. "It was in Margaret's desk drawer, tucked away beneath some papers. The police found it when they were going through her things." Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her words were deliberate. "And did it say what I expect it did?" Sylvia gave a tight nod. "You're next." The words settled between them, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Miss Marple sighed, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "That is most interesting." At that moment, Dr. Hayward, the village doctor, strode past on his way back from the Felton house. He looked weary, his usual composure fraying at the edges. Sylvia hesitated, then called out, "Doctor, what are people supposed to think?" Dr. Hayward paused, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket before answering. "They're supposed to think there's nothing to worry about, Mrs. Ashford." "But is that true?" Miss Marple asked mildly. His jaw tightened, but he gave a small, polite nod before continuing on his way. Miss Marple watched him go. People were so rarely honest in what they said. But in what they left unsaid, now that was where the truth lived. And something told her the truth in Little Beechwood was far from pleasant. The Beechwood Arms, the only inn in Little Beechwood, was unusually crowded that evening. What had begun as nervous whispers in the streets had gathered force, rolling through the village like an unstoppable tide. Now, villagers clustered in tight groups, their voices rising and falling in urgent, anxious tones. "It's clear as day! Someone's targeting people!" cried Beatrice Harper, her plump face pale. "Edwin and Margaret both got those notes, and now they're dead. What does that tell you?" "It tells me that people jump to conclusions far too easily," said Arthur Fenimore, the local solicitor, adjusting his spectacles. "We have no proof that these deaths are connected." "No proof." Reverend Norris shook his head. "Come now, Arthur, surely you can't deny it. First Edwin, then Margaret. Both were respected members of the community. What if there's a pattern?" "Or a list," murmured Alice Turner, the postmistress, her voice barely above a whisper. That single word sent a ripple of unease through the room. A list. The idea had already begun to take root in their minds. Mr. Phelps, the grocer, exhaled sharply. "I'll tell you this much. I don't like it. And I don't like that the police are just standing about saying, 'Nothing to see here.' How many more of us have to die before they do something?" The murmurs grew louder, sharper, edged with panic. Fear, once planted, had a way of growing like ivy, curling into every thought and conversation. Somewhere near the back of the room, Miss Marple stirred her tea calmly, listening. Unlike the others, Miss Marple did not panic. She simply watched. Fear did strange things to people. It made them talk too much, made them betray themselves in the smallest of ways. A nervous glance, an unsteady hand, a silence where there ought to be an objection. She noted how Reverend Norris had drawn back into the shadows, his expression uneasy. How Alice Turner kept glancing at the door, as though expecting someone, or fearing they might arrive. Arthur Fenimore, ever the rational man, had folded his arms and said nothing, yet his fingers drummed absently against the table. A man in control of his words, but not of his nerves. And then there was Dr. Hayward. Seated alone by the window, his face unreadable, he was the only man who had said nothing at all. Miss Marple took another sip of tea. People always revealed more than they intended, if one only knew how to listen. By the following morning, Little Beechwood was no longer simply afraid. It was divided. The village had split into cliques of suspicion. One group firmly believed that an outsider had done it, some unknown figure lurking on the edges of their quiet community. Strangers, drifters, even the old tramp who occasionally passed through the village. They were all suddenly objects of deep distrust. Another group was convinced that the murderer was among them. "These are targeted killings," Beatrice Harper insisted. Whoever it is, they know exactly who they're after. It has to be someone inside the village." Arthur Fenimore scoffed. "And I suppose you have a suspect in mind." Beatrice folded her arms. "All I'm saying is some people aren't acting quite right." Old grudges, long buried, had begun to surface. Petty feuds, jealousies, resentments. Things that had nothing to do with the murders, yet in times of fear, became suddenly significant. And through it all, Miss Marple simply observed. She knew that truth, once disturbed, had a way of rising to the surface. It was only a matter of time. Chapter 3. A Web of Connections. Miss Marple believed in the power of casual conversation. People rarely revealed secrets when asked directly, but in the natural flow of chatter over a cup of tea, when they felt comfortable. Oh, that was when the truth slipped through. That morning she found herself in the company of Mrs. Phelps, the grocer's wife, and Beatrice Harper, the village's most enthusiastic collector of other people's misfortunes. "I dare say it's all terribly unsettling," Beatrice was saying, her voice low but eager. "Edwin and Margaret both gone like that." She shook her head gravely, though her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Of course, one wonders what they might have done to deserve such a thing." "Deserve?" Miss Marple echoed mildly, stirring her tea. "Well, you know, dear." Beatrice leaned in, voice hushed. "Some people aren't as respectable as they seem. And Edwin, well, he may have looked dull as ditch water, but I always thought there was something about him. And Margaret, oh, she had her secrets." Miss Marple did not press. She only nodded, her expression expectant, encouraging Beatrice to continue. "Oh, I shouldn't say another word," Beatrice said, though she clearly wanted to. "But if you ask me, their past caught up with them." Miss Marple looked down at her teacup, concealing a smile. A past that had been long forgotten. Until now. Later, as Miss Marple walked with Reverend Norris through the churchyard, she let the conversation drift, as though quite by accident, toward Edwin and Margaret. "They were good people, Reverend?" she asked, her tone light. He hesitated, a fraction of a second too long. "Good? Oh, yes, I suppose so," he said finally. "They attended church, of course, supported the community." A pause. "In recent years, at least." Miss Marple turned toward him, but her expression remained kind, interested, never demanding. "People change, don't they?" she said. The Reverend exhaled. "Yes," he admitted, "but some never quite outrun their past." Miss Marple nodded, waiting. "There was an incident many years ago. A young girl, Alice Carter." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Alice Carter?" The Reverend nodded. "She drowned in the river. Tragic accident. But there were always whispers, that some knew more than they said." Miss Marple did not speak, but inwardly she understood. Edwin and Margaret had been part of something that had not been forgotten, and now it had returned to claim them. Miss Marple found Dr. Hayward standing by the church gate, absently tapping his walking stick against the stone wall. He seemed lost in thought, his usual composed manner fraying at the edges. "Doctor," Miss Marple greeted warmly. "A difficult time for the village." Dr. Hayward exhaled. "Indeed, Miss Marple. I dare say I haven't had a moment's peace since this all began." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Poor Edwin Lansing. I understand he had been rather troubled before he passed?" The doctor hesitated. Just a fraction too long. Troubled? He forced a dry chuckle. "Well, he was. Nervous, perhaps. But these are difficult times, and men his age do have their worries." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Worries of the past, I should think, rather than the present." Dr. Hayward stilled. Then, with a sigh, he removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "He said something peculiar a few days before he died," he admitted at last. "He told me he had made a terrible mistake, one he could never put right." Miss Marple nodded, filing the words away. "He didn't say what it was?" she asked lightly. Dr. Hayward shook his head. "Number only, that it was long ago." His fingers tightened around his cane. "And that it was coming back for him." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful hum. A mistake from the past. A mistake that killed. Miss Marple moved through the village with quiet purpose, her mind sorting through what she had learned. People rarely admitted the whole truth, but they always left clues in what they didn't say. At the post office, Alice Turner fumbled her ledger when Miss Marple mentioned Edwin's name. Arthur Fenimore was unusually curt when asked about Margaret Felton's younger days, and Reverend Norris, always a man of conviction, seemed uneasy when speaking of the past. A pattern was forming. The victims, Edwin and Margaret, were not just two unfortunate villagers who had died under strange circumstances. They had been linked by something unspoken, buried in the past, and now clawing its way back to the surface. Miss Marple sat quietly in Sylvia Ashford's sitting room that evening, sipping her tea. "I have a feeling, my dear," she said at last, "that Edwin and Margaret were not chosen at random." Sylvia frowned. "You mean someone planned this?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but I believe the question is not just who is doing the killing." She set her teacup down gently. "The real question is why now?" Chapter 4. The Elusive Clue. Miss Marple had always believed that murderers made mistakes, not in the act itself, but in the small things they overlooked. And so, when she learned that both Edwin Lansing and Margaret Felton had received letters a week before their deaths, she knew she had found something worth looking into. "Strange business, that," said Alice Turner, the postmistress, as she sorted through a stack of envelopes. "Edwin came in last Monday, looking proper shaken, asked if anything had come for him, said he was expecting a letter. When I handed it over, he just stood there staring at it." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking gently. "And Margaret?" Alice hesitated. "She got one the same day. Didn't open it here, though, just tucked it into her handbag and left in a hurry." Miss Marple's hand stilled for the briefest moment. "And do you happen to recall the handwriting?" Alice frowned. "Odd, now that you mention it. It was block letters, plain as anything. No return address." Miss Marple nodded, murmuring her thanks. 2 letters, 2 deaths. Someone had sent a warning, or a summons, and Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that Margaret Felton had left behind something worth finding. Margaret Felton's home was silent now, its grand presence dimmed by the weight of her absence. Miss Marple, with Sylvia Ashford beside her, moved through the rooms carefully, noting the little things. The teacup still on the sideboard, the faint scent of lavender, the locked desk drawer. This would be where she kept important papers. Miss Marple murmured, trying the handle. It did not give. Sylvia frowned. "I don't suppose the police—" "They would have looked," Miss Marple agreed. "But they were searching for evidence of a crime. I, dear Sylvia, am searching for a secret." With a small twist of a hairpin, the drawer gave way, revealing neatly stacked papers, old letters, and a small yellowed newspaper clipping. Miss Marple lifted it carefully. The print had faded, but the words remained. "Tragic accident. Young girl drowns in Beechwood River." She glanced at Sylvia, her voice quiet, but firm. Alice Carter. A forgotten name, a buried tragedy. And now, it seemed, A reason for murder. Miss Marple examined the old newspaper clipping, her fingers resting lightly on the faded print. The article was brief, tucked into a corner of the page, as though it had never been of much importance. Tragic accident in Beechwood River. Local girl drowns. The report detailed how Alice Carter, aged 14, had slipped and fallen into the river one summer evening. The current had been strong, the search for her body long and painful. A tragic accident, nothing more. Or so it had seemed. Miss Marple had encountered far too many accidents in her time that were, in truth, something else entirely. Sylvia Ashford peered over her shoulder. Alice Carter. I haven't heard that name in years. Miss Marple's gaze did not leave the page. And yet, someone has not forgotten her. Sylvia hesitated. You think it's connected? Miss Marple tapped the article thoughtfully. Alice Carter drowned many years ago, and now 2 people who were alive at the time of her death have been murdered. Sylvia drew in a sharp breath. This isn't a coincidence, is it? Miss Marple folded the newspaper clipping carefully, slipping it into her handbag. My dear, she said gently, coincidences are very rare indeed. Miss Marple had always believed that secrets had a way of surfacing, especially those that were meant to stay buried. And now, standing in the quiet of Sylvia's sitting room, she thought of Alice Carter, a child whose life had ended too soon. It says here that Alice fell into the river, Sylvia murmured, rereading the article. But I do remember, there were whispers, that it wasn't quite so simple. Miss Marple nodded. And do you recall who started those whispers? Sylvia hesitated. It's hard to say, but there were people who didn't seem as shocked as they ought to have been. Miss Marple thought back to Edwin Lansing's final days. His nerves, his cryptic remark about a mistake he could never put right, to Margaret Felton's guarded past, to Dr. Hayward's silence. They had all been there when Alice Carter drowned, and now they were all dead. Miss Marple closed her handbag with a soft click. Alice Carter's death was never an accident, she said at last. Somebody made certain she would never tell a secret. And now, years later, someone was making certain that secret remained buried. Chapter 5. The next target? The fear in Little Beechwood had been growing, creeping into conversations, darkening glances exchanged over market stalls and tea tables. But when the news spread that Victor Hollings had received a note, just like Edwin and Margaret before him, fear turned to panic. Victor, once a respected solicitor, had long since withdrawn from village life. He rarely spoke to anyone, kept his house locked, and avoided gatherings. And now, it seemed, someone had not forgotten him. Miss Marple observed him from the corner of the post office, where he stood gripping an envelope, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly, as he stuffed it into his coat pocket. Sylvia Ashford whispered, "He's frightened, Jane." He won't say a word, but just look at him. Miss Marple did not need to be told. Fear spoke in many languages, and in Victor's case, it was in the way he avoided meeting anyone's gaze, the way his fingers clenched as though to steady himself. She stepped forward gently. "Mr. Hollings," she said kindly. His head snapped up. I've nothing to say." Miss Marple smiled, warm and unassuming. "Oh, I never ask for much, dear. Only, it is such a dreadful thing, these notes appearing. And for you to receive one, well, it must feel rather personal." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "They mean nothing." But Miss Marple knew a lie when she heard one. Miss Marple had spent her life watching, listening, and quietly fitting pieces together. And though Victor refused to speak, his fear had already told her there was a reason he had been chosen. The answer, she suspected, lay in Alice Carter. She spoke to Mrs. Lorimer, the vicar's wife, who had a way of remembering family connections. "Oh, Victor Hollings." Mrs. Lorimer frowned. "Strange man. Moved here years ago. Retired early. No one really knows much about him, though." She hesitated, lowering her voice. "He was related to that poor girl, Alice Carter." Miss Marple's knitting needle stilled. "Related? Alice's uncle, her mother's brother." Mrs. Lorimer's brow furrowed. "Of course, that was years ago. After the girl drowned, the whole family fell apart. But Victor never left." Miss Marple murmured her thanks and walked away, deep in thought. Edwin Lansing, Margaret Felton, and now Victor Hollings, all of them connected to Alice Carter. The past was closing in, and Miss Marple knew that if Victor truly feared for his life, then perhaps he had more to confess than just a family tie. The village of Little Beechwood slept uneasily that night. The recent deaths had settled into people's minds, an unspoken fear creeping through locked doors and drawn curtains. But at Victor Hollings' cottage, fear was not just a feeling. It was a presence. A sharp clatter shattered the silence. Somewhere inside, a chair toppled, a gasp cut short. Victor stumbled backward, his breath coming in quick, ragged gulps. He had heard the lock turn, the soft creak of the door opening, and now there was someone in his house. He fumbled in the dark, heart pounding. A shadow moved, a figure, silent and deliberate. Victor did not wait. Self-preservation took over. He lunged for the side door, stumbling out into the cold night air, his feet barely steady beneath him. A voice, low, urgent, called from behind. "Hollings!" But Victor did not stop. He knew what happened to people who received those notes. Down the path, his foot caught on a loose stone. He went sprawling, breath knocked from his lungs. Behind him, the shadow paused, watching. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. By the time the villagers found Victor shaking, wide-eyed, muttering about shadows and death, the only trace left behind was an open door swinging in the wind, and Miss Marple standing at a distance, her sharp eyes lingering on that empty doorway. The killer was still hunting. Victor Hollings had escaped with his life, but Miss Marple knew the truth. Someone was not finished. She sat with Sylvia Ashford the next morning, her hands folded over her knitting, her mind turning over the events. "Edwin, Margaret, Victor," Sylvia mused. "Whoever is behind this, they aren't picking victims at random." Miss Marple nodded. "No, dear. There is a purpose to it." The answer had been forming quietly, piece by piece. Edwin Lansing, Margaret Felton, and Victor Hollings had all been linked to Alice Carter's tragic drowning. "Alice's death was not an accident," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And now, one by one, those who might have known the truth are being removed." Sylvia's voice was barely above a whisper. "To silence them." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Perhaps. But there's another question." Sylvia blinked. "Which is? Why now?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but firm. "Alice Carter died years ago. Why has this killer waited until now to strike?" Sylvia frowned, thinking. Something must have changed. Miss Marple exhaled. "Yes, my dear. And I intend to find out exactly what." She reached for her tea, but her mind was elsewhere. The past had returned to Little Beechwood, and unless she uncovered its secrets soon, the killer would strike again. Chapter 6. A red herring and a startling confession. Fear had taken root in Little Beechwood, spreading like ivy through whispers and knowing glances. And now, a new name had begun to surface in hushed conversations. Henry Carter. Miss Marple first heard it at the greengrocer's, where Mrs. Phelps was speaking in low, urgent tones. I tell you he's back," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "And no good will come of it." Miss Marple, idly inspecting a basket of apples, listened carefully. "Henry Carter?" Mr. Phelps scoffed. "After all these years? That boy vanished the day after Alice drowned. Never came back, never wrote." Mrs. Phelps shuddered. "Well, he's back now. I saw him myself just yesterday, lurking near the churchyard, staring at Alice's grave." Miss Marple glanced up, her expression mild. "A brother mourning his sister, perhaps?" Mrs. Phelps sniffed. "A brother coming back to settle old scores, more like." The villagers had never forgiven Henry for disappearing after Alice's death. Some claimed it was guilt, others swore he had been driven away by what he knew. Miss Marple merely nodded, her mind working. A man who had fled his past had suddenly returned, just as those involved in Alice's death were being picked off, one by one. A coincidence? Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences. That evening Miss Marple and Sylvia Ashford sat by the fire, the flickering glow casting long shadows across the room. Sylvia poured tea, her hands unsteady. "I spoke to Agnes Browning today," she murmured. Miss Marple looked up. "The old maid who worked at the Carter house." Sylvia nodded. "She had a bit too much brandy and, well, she started talking." Miss Marple waited. "She said Alice didn't fall." Sylvia whispered. "She was pushed." The words hung heavy between them. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup. "She saw it?" Sylvia hesitated. "Not exactly, but she said there was a terrible row that night, screaming by the river. And then, suddenly, silence." Miss Marple exhaled slowly. For years the village had accepted Alice's death as an accident. A tragedy, yes, but a simple one. But now, the truth was beginning to surface, and someone was willing to kill to keep it buried. Henry Carter had been the perfect suspect. A man with a troubled past, a connection to the victims, and a convenient return to the village just as the murders began. But then, before he could answer a single question, he was found dead. Miss Marple heard the news at dawn, when Sylvia Ashford arrived, breathless, her hands gripping the edge of the breakfast table. "He's dead, Jane," she whispered. "Henry Carter. Someone killed him." Miss Marple looked up from her teacup. "How?" Sylvia swallowed hard. "A blow to the head. He was found near the old mill." No note this time. That, Miss Marple thought, was significant. The village was in an uproar. People had been so certain that Henry was behind it all, that he had returned to exact revenge for Alice's death. And now? Now the real killer had just proven them wrong. "Whoever is behind this," Miss Marple murmured, "is still at large." Sylvia's voice shook. "And Jane, what if they haven't finished yet?" Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. A dead man could not be the murderer, which meant that the truth was still buried somewhere in Little Beechwood, and someone who had already killed 3 people, was still willing to kill again. Fear had taken hold of Little Beechwood, but Miss Marple was not convinced. She had seen it before, how a village turned on the easiest suspect, how people whispered together, eager to make sense of fear by giving it a name. But fear was often blind. As she walked through the village listening to hurried conversations, she noted the small things. How Arthur Fenimore, the solicitor, seemed relieved rather than horrified. How Dr. Hayward, always calm, now seemed troubled, his hands fidgeting as he spoke. And how Victor Hollings, once paralyzed with fear, now seemed almost at ease. Henry Carter's death had been quick, brutal, and, above all, convenient. Miss Marple pressed her gloved hands together. "Too convenient," she murmured to herself. The real question was not just who was killing those connected to Alice Carter's past. It was why now? Because something had changed. Something had forced a hand that had stayed silent for years. Miss Marple glanced toward the old riverbank, where Alice Carter had died so long ago. She had a feeling the answer lay there, and she also had a feeling that the killer was not done yet. Chapter 7. Miss Marple's Theory. Miss Marple sat by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind quietly sorting through the facts. Every murder had been targeted. Edwin Lansing, Margaret Felton, Victor Hollings, Henry Carter. All had been connected to Alice Carter's tragic drowning. But what was the missing link? She recalled Edwin's final words to Dr. Hayward. A mistake he could never put right. Margaret's fear. Victor's silence. And then there was Henry Carter. He had run away all those years ago, yet his return had been met with immediate death. Miss Marple exhaled softly. It was all too deliberate. Somebody was clearing away the past, yet something did not fit. The killer had been careful, planned, methodical. But the notes, those chilling warnings scrawled on slips of paper, felt different, messy, desperate, almost like a warning. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly. What if the murderer had not written them? What if someone else had known what was coming? She reached for her handbag, removing the 2 surviving notes. A phrase floated into her mind, something she had learned long ago. Murderers are careful. Fearful people are not. And suddenly, she had an idea of exactly where to look next. Miss Marple's inquiries were always gentle, almost absent-minded, but they were never without purpose. She took the ominous notes to Alice Turner, the postmistress, under the pretense of needing a new pair of reading spectacles. "Such an odd thing, Alice," Miss Marple murmured, unfolding one of the notes. "You're next. Quite dramatic, isn't it?" Alice hesitated, eyes flicking to the paper. "Horrid business, that." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I suppose the police compared the handwriting." Alice frowned, looking uncomfortable. "Well, I imagine so." Miss Marple tapped the edge of the note. "But you see, my dear, it doesn't match." Alice's lips parted. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "It's rather simple. Whoever wrote these notes was not the killer. They were written by someone else entirely." Alice went very still. Miss Marple continued, her tone light but precise. "Perhaps by someone who knew what was coming." A long silence stretched between them. Then Alice Turner did something very peculiar. She dropped the stack of letters she had been holding. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. There it was, the final, missing piece. Someone in Little Beechwood had tried to warn the victims. The real question was, why had they waited so long? Miss Marple sat in Sylvia Ashford's parlour, her knitting untouched, her mind carefully piecing together the final puzzle. The notes, "You're next," had always felt odd. The writing had been hurried, the message more like a warning than a threat. And now, she understood why. "These weren't the killer's notes," she said quietly. "They were written by the victims." Sylvia's teacup rattled against its saucer. "The victims!" Miss Marple nodded. "Each of them must have realized the truth, that someone was eliminating those who knew what happened to Alice Carter. They were desperate, frightened, and when they understood they were next, they tried to warn the others." Sylvia swallowed hard. "But why wouldn't they just tell the police?" Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "Because, my dear, guilt is a terrible thing. Whatever they knew, whatever part they had played in Alice's death, it was enough to keep them silent all these years. But when it became clear that silence would not save them, they tried to break the chain. She exhaled softly. Too late. Sylvia whispered. Then Victor's note. Edwin's note. Margaret's. All written in fear, Miss Marple murmured. They thought they could warn the next person in line. But the killer was always one step ahead. And now, Miss Marple suspected, there was only one name left on that list. Miss Marple's deductions had led her here, to the final truth. The victims were not random. They were not being punished for something new. They were being erased. Sylvia clutched the arms of her chair. But Jane, why now? After all these years? Miss Marple's eyes were sharp, because someone was afraid the truth would finally come out. She glanced down at the newspaper clipping she had saved. The story of Alice Carter's drowning. A tragedy, sealed away for so many years. And then, something had changed. The past had stayed buried, Miss Marple murmured, until Henry Carter returned. Sylvia's breath caught. Henry knew the truth. Miss Marple nodded. And so did the others. But Henry's return, his questions, his presence, threatened to unravel it all. The others had grown complacent, thinking the past had been forgotten. But suddenly, it wasn't. And the person who had kept their secret for years had decided to end it for good. Miss Marple reached for her gloves. Someone in this village is trying to erase the past, dear, she said calmly. And if we don't stop them, they will kill again. Chapter 8. The Killer Unmasked. Miss Marple knew that murderers were often clever, but never quite clever enough. Their greatest weakness was always fear, the fear of being found out, and she intended to use that to her advantage. Over tea with Alice Turner, the postmistress, Miss Marple sighed in her usual gentle way. Such a terrible business, she murmured. Though I suppose it was only a matter of time before someone talked. Alice paused, her spoon hovering over her sugar bowl. Talked? Miss Marple nodded, stirring her tea. Oh, yes. You see, dear, it seems one of the victims left a note. Quite a revealing one, too. A name. Or part of one, at least. Alice's fingers tightened around her cup. A name. Miss Marple sighed. Such a pity, really. The note was terribly smudged, but the police found just enough of it. They're keeping it safe. At the vicarage, I believe. The words drifted through the village like wildfire. By noon, it was on Mrs. Phelps's lips, then Beatrice Harper's, then the butcher's wife's. And by sundown, Miss Marple was certain. The killer had heard it too. Now, all she had to do was wait. The vicarage was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner, hands folded neatly over her knitting. Beside her, Reverend Norris clutched a brass candlestick, though he looked rather as though he wished he were somewhere else. Across the room, Arthur Fenimore, the solicitor, barely breathed. The police constable stationed near the door was still as stone. The trap was set, and then a sound, a faint creak of floorboards, the rustling of cloth. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. A shadow moved near the desk. Then, a hand reached for the drawer. A figure, careful, methodical, searching for the fabricated note. Miss Marple spoke softly. I wouldn't do that if I were you. The figure froze. The gas lamp flared, revealing Dr. Hayward. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then finally, the doctor exhaled, slowly. So, he murmured, you know. Miss Marple simply smiled. Yes, my dear, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I know. Dr. Hayward stood frozen by the desk, his fingers still gripping the drawer handle. His face, usually composed, was stretched taut with realization. Miss Marple's voice, gentle yet firm, broke the silence. "You were looking for something, Doctor?" For a fleeting moment his composure returned, the familiar measured expression of a man accustomed to authority. But when he turned to speak, his voice was too controlled, too careful. "This is ridiculous," he said smoothly. "I was merely—" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Looking for a note that does not exist?" Dr. Hayward's eyes flickered, a second too long, a heartbeat too uncertain. Arthur Fenimore, the solicitor, cleared his throat. A respectable man of medicine, breaking into the vicarage in the middle of the night. His voice was dripping with suspicion. Dr. Hayward exhaled sharply, his patience fraying. "You're all making a mistake." Miss Marple's hands remained still in her lap. "I rather think not, Doctor." She observed him as only she could, the slight tremor in his fingers, the tightness in his jaw, the way his gaze darted towards the door as if calculating an escape. "You thought you were safe," Miss Marple continued, her voice almost kind. "For years you were. No one asked questions about Alice Carter's death. No one saw a reason to." She let the words settle, watching as the weight of them pressed upon him. And then, Henry Carter returned. Dr. Hayward stiffened. Miss Marple sighed softly. And suddenly, you weren't safe at all. The tension in the room was suffocating. Dr. Hayward's breath grew shallow. Then, in a desperate, wild motion, he lurched forward, toward the desk, toward Miss Marple. Perhaps toward a final act of silence, but the constable was quicker. A firm hand gripped Dr. Hayward's arm, yanking him back before he could make another move. It was over, and Miss Marple, watching him collapse into his own failure, already knew the truth that would follow. Dr. Hayward sat in the vicar's study, his mask of civility now shattered, his hands, once steady, twisted in his lap. Miss Marple watched him quietly. Then, in a voice neither accusing nor sympathetic, she simply asked, "Alice Carter was your daughter, wasn't she?" A sharp breath escaped him. For a moment he did not speak. But then, his shoulders slumped. His voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. "Yes." Miss Marple nodded as though she had known all along. "You kept it hidden," she said gently. "A doctor, a man of standing. A child born out of wedlock would have been quite the scandal." Dr. Hayward swallowed. "No one knew. Not even her mother. She died without ever knowing the truth. And Alice," his voice broke. "She never knew either." A long silence followed. Then Miss Marple, ever so softly, asked the question that hung in the air. "What happened that night by the river?" Dr. Hayward's face paled further, his hands clenched. "It was an accident," he rasped. She found something. Letters, papers. She confronted Edwin and Margaret. I don't know what was said, but..." His breathing grew uneven. "She ran. She wasn't looking where she was going. The river was fast that night." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "You didn't push her," she said. "But you covered it up." Dr. Hayward let out a long, shaking sigh. "I had to. If the truth came out..." His voice faltered. Miss Marple's tone was quiet but unyielding. "And when Edwin and Margaret realized they could no longer live with the secret, you silenced them." A single tear slipped down Dr. Hayward's cheek. "Yes," he whispered. "I had no choice." Miss Marple, folding her hands, sighed. "There is always a choice, Doctor." And outside, the village of Little Beechwood remained still, as if holding its breath. Chapter 9. Justice and the Final Reflection. Dr. Hayward sat in the vicarage study, his shoulders hunched, his hands loosely clasped in his lap. His once proud posture had crumbled, leaving behind only the remnants of a man who had spent too long running from his own sins. Miss Marple, ever composed, watched him with quiet patience. "I never meant for it to happen," he said at last, his voice raw. "Not the first time." Miss Marple nodded, neither condemning nor reassuring. "But then it did happen, and you made a choice." Dr. Hayward let out a shuddering breath. "I was a young man," he murmured, "ambitious, respected, a child born out of wedlock. It would have ruined me." His voice dropped lower. "When Alice drowned, I told myself it was fate, that it was easier this way." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Easier for whom, Doctor?" He flinched. "I told no one," he continued, barely above a whisper. "I buried my guilt, and for years it worked, until Henry Carter came back." A long silence stretched between them. I could see it in his eyes. Dr. Hayward went on. He knew. Maybe not the full truth, but enough. And then, Edwin, Margaret, even Victor. He swallowed hard. "They weren't innocent, Miss Marple. They knew what happened that night by the river. They had stood by, said nothing." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "And neither did you." Dr. Hayward exhaled shakily. "I had to stop them," he whispered. "I had no choice." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "There is always a choice, Doctor," she said quietly. "You simply made the wrong one." The constable stepped forward. Dr. Hayward did not resist. As he was led away, he did not look back. But Miss Marple, hands folded in her lap, already knew. Some ghosts never leave. Little Beechwood was not a place accustomed to secrets unraveling so violently. The news spread swiftly, carried in hushed voices over tea tables, in tight clusters outside the greengrocer's. Dr. Hayward, trusted, respected, admired, was a murderer. Mrs. Phelps, the butcher's wife, shook her head. "Imagine, after all these years." Beatrice Harper clutched her shawl tighter. "He delivered both my children, you know." Her voice wavered. "I trusted him." Miss Marple listened, as she always did, without interrupting. There was no excitement in the gossip today, no gleeful unraveling of scandal. Instead, there was disbelief, unease, a sorrow that stretched deeper than words. Sylvia Ashford sat beside Miss Marple, her expression troubled. "Do you ever wonder, Jane, what would have happened if Henry Carter had never returned?" Miss Marple's fingers idly traced the rim of her teacup. "The past does not stay buried forever, dear," she murmured. "Not when it has unfinished business." Sylvia shivered. "And Alice Carter." Miss Marple turned toward the window, where the river flowed quietly through the village, the same as it always had. "She was never truly forgotten," she said softly. A long silence settled between them. Then, with a small sigh, Miss Marple reached for her knitting, as if nothing had changed. But the village of Little Beechwood would never be quite the same again. The fire crackled gently in Sylvia Ashford's sitting room, casting a warm glow over the well-worn furnishings. Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair, her knitting resting in her lap, though she had not touched it for some time. Outside, the village of Little Beechwood was settling back into its usual rhythms. But there was a difference now, a weight in the air, a lingering hush. Sylvia poured tea, her movements careful, deliberate. "It's a strange thing, Jane," she murmured. "People always think they can outrun the past." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her fingers smoothing a fold in her skirt. "Yes, dear. But the past is a rather patient thing, isn't it? It waits." Sylvia sighed. "I suppose Dr. Hayward believed he had buried his secret for good." Miss Marple nodded. "And for a time he had." She gazed into the fire, her voice soft. "But guilt has a way of lingering, Sylvia. Even when one believes it forgotten, it lingers in the way one hesitates before speaking a name, in the way one's hands tremble when old memories surface. Sylvia sat back thoughtful. And yet, none of us ever suspected him. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, though she made no move to resume her stitches. That is the nature of secrets, dear. They thrive in the most respectable of places, behind the most familiar of faces. Sylvia shivered slightly. It's unsettling, really. We trust people simply because we've always trusted them. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Human nature, my dear. She sipped her tea, her gaze distant. We see what we wish to see. The fire crackled again, filling the silence. Then Sylvia, after a long pause, said quietly, "And Alice?" Miss Marple's smile faded. She was never truly forgotten. The wind rattled the window pane, and for a fleeting moment, it almost sounded like a whisper. The morning mist clung to the village as Miss Marple stood by the bridge, gazing down at the river below. The water, calm and unassuming, hid no traces of the past. And yet beneath its surface, a tragedy had unfolded, a tragedy that had remained silent for years. Miss Marple's hands rested lightly on the wooden railing. Little Beechwood would heal, as villages always did. The gossip would fade, life would continue. But for some, the shadow of what had happened would never fully disappear. The Ashford approached quietly. I thought I'd find you here. Miss Marple gave a small smile. It seemed fitting, dear. Sylvia glanced down at the water. Do you think she ever knew? Alice, I mean. Miss Marple sighed. Perhaps not in life, but in the end the truth found its way to the surface. Sylvia shivered. Do you ever wonder, Jane, why people go to such lengths to hide the past? Miss Marple's eyes softened. Because, my dear, the past is the only thing that never changes, and for some that is the most terrifying thing of all. A long pause. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, the faintest hint of a sigh escaping her lips. Well, she said, I suppose it's time I caught my train. She turned, taking one last look at the river, then murmured, so softly that the words barely carried. Rest easy, child. You were never truly forgotten. Then, with her usual graceful step, she walked away, leaving little Beechwood behind. But the river remained, and somewhere, in the hush of the morning, it seemed to whisper back,